Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Xils Lab Xils 4 tutorial series. Going to have a look at the oscillators today, figure out how to make sound with them and also how to use them as modulation sources. If you enjoy this series and you want to help support my channel, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Awesome way to do that. First thing that I'm going to do is to create myself a really simple brand new default preset. I don't propose to spend too much time talking about the preset management in this system. I really want to talk about the thing as an analog synthesizer, but I'm just going to create myself a quick preset here. I'm going to start with the Xils 4 init 2 oscillator left preset. But there's a little bit too much colour in that. I want to get it really simplified. So this is what I'm going to do to create myself an absolutely baseline sound. First thing, I'm going to turn Portamento off. Then I'm going to remove the filter from the matrix entirely. If we have a look at the moment, the oscillators are going into the filter, out of the filter, into the envelope. I'm going to bypass that by disconnecting the filters entirely. And I'm going to send one single oscillator directly into the envelope. We'll start with the sine wave. That envelope signal is going to come out of the envelope straight to the output. One final thing that I'm going to do is get rid of that. Hear the length of the release on this sound. I'm going to click the envelope shaper and I'm going to turn it into an ADSR envelope. We'll talk more about envelopes in detail later. That was a hanging note then. So I'm just going to set my release to 12 o'clock. Don't worry about any of this. This is not the purpose of today. I'm just setting myself up this really simple preset. That's about as simple as a sound can get. Once we get there, I'm going to save that preset. Go into your little double save icon up here, and you're going to create yourself some new presets. I'm going to create a new bank. Well, I've already got my bank called Anthony. Author is me. Type is init. Style is tutorial. Don't care about the rest of it. So I'm going to save it as 1osc. Now, for some reason on my system, when you type, the text is black. You have to highlight it. I'm not sure why that is, but you can see the name is 1osc. Save, and that's that done. And now I've got my default preset. I can get back here whenever I want. We have a look in our Anthony init folder. Here's my 1osc preset. Okay, off we go. Each oscillator has two different waveforms. Oscillator 1 has a sine wave and a sawtooth wave. At the moment, only the sine wave oscillator is plugged into the matrix. Let's zoom in again, just to clarify that that's the case. And if I hold a note down, one of the reasons why I switched to an ADSR envelope is that I can now hold a key down and it will sound perpetually. Default behavior of the synthesizer doesn't do that. It makes it easier for me to do demonstrations. So here I'm holding the note down and you can see something that kind of resembles a sine wave, but a sine wave only has a single harmonic. And if you have a look in the spectrum analyzer below, there's all sorts of stuff going on. So that's clearly not a single harmonic. We can, however, simplify it a little bit more. You see this shape knob? I'm going to set this to 50% or 12 o'clock. Now, remember, when the matrix is zoomed in, you don't get to see this little pop-up box telling you what the current value is. I want it set to exactly 50%. Now, when I press a single note, this is the closest this particular analog synthesizer, developed in 1970. Most analog synthesizers developed in 1970 can't do better than this for generating a sine wave. There are a couple of very small harmonics. That's just basically the function of an analog synthesizer. This is as good as you're going to get. So at 12 o'clock with the shape knob, we're generating as close as we can to a sine wave. As I turn this left or right, what it's basically going to do is introduce new harmonics. Now, the manual says it only adds odd harmonics, but that's not actually true. If you have a look in the spectrum analyzer, this is a tone at 260 Hertz. It's going to add all of the harmonics. In other words, multiples of 260 all the way up the spectrum. Let's start increasing the shape knob and you can see them appear. Here's our first harmonic at 523, and then we're basically adding 260 on each time for each of these extra harmonics. As we turn it up more and more, what we're basically doing is we're creating something that roughly resembles a kind of sawtooth wave with a lot of the top end cut off. A sawtooth wave has all of the harmonics of the harmonic series, and that's what we've got here. With a sawtooth, you have a different frequency distribution, so you're going to get a different tone, but that's in the ballpark of what we've got here. What I'm going to do now is use the other sound generator in Oscillator 1, which does actually generate a sawtooth, and we'll compare those two sounds. So I'm going to disengage the sine wave by right-clicking, engage the sawtooth by left-clicking, close that down. Now we're going to get a sawtooth, have a look in the spectrum analyzer and hear what a sawtooth sounds like. Very brash, very harsh, but look at the frequencies: 260, 520, 700 and blah blah blah. It's basically going up in multiples of 260. Exactly the same as the shaped sine wave. I'm going to take a tiny diversion here today. This is kind of a bonus extra. We don't need to worry about this. But what I'm going to do is send the sawtooth into the filter unit instead. Come out of the filter unit into the envelope. So I've brought this filter unit back in, and if I attenuate up to about somewhere around here, there we go. That's in the ballpark of sounding reasonably similar to the thing we had with our sine wave. Have a look in the oscilloscope. It looks like this kind of slightly deformed sine wave with this curve. We head back to our other sound where we started earlier. Steeper cutoff, steeper troughs, but once again, we're in the ballpark. Those two sounds are relatively similar. Each oscillator can output both of those waveforms optionally, individually or simultaneously. So if I plug in both the sawtooth and the sine wave, we're going to get a combination of those two things. But bear in mind, there's only a single shape knob, so I have to decide whether or not I want the deformed features of the sawtooth or the sine wave, or any combination thereof. Currently, this sounds like this. So we've now got a pretty complex shape in the oscilloscope. But the important thing is, most of the harmonics are there. As I bring this shape knob back to 12 o'clock, we transform both of those waveforms simultaneously. The sine wave is being turned back into as close to a pure sine wave as possible. The sawtooth, what technically is actually happening with the sawtooth when its shape knob is adjusted, is that a second pulse, a second sawtooth waveform is being introduced, and those two things are being mixed together. We have a look at that all on its own. See in the oscilloscope, just zoom in a bit. Basically, we've got two different sawtooths, kind of out of phase with each other. Imagine it's like two sawtooth waves that are out of phase with each other. Here's one, here's another, and there's partial cancellation. I'm going to hop back over to sine wave because there's only so long I can stand listening to a sawtooth on its own before I go crazy. Sine wave's a little bit less offensive. Now we'll have a look at the pitch adjustment knob on the left hand side. There are two controls on this knob. The outer silver ring allows us to jump up in multiple octaves. Now bear in mind, this doesn't mean no octave adjustment plus 1 octave. It actually jumps up in double octave steps. We have a look back at our tuner. It's set to 0. If we have a look at the pop-up, it says plus 1 octave. So that's kind of implying to me that the native synthesizer underneath is actually generating a tone at 130 hertz. And the default behavior of the oscillator adjustment, the pitch adjustment, is to transpose it up to 260. I'm not entirely sure, and it doesn't particularly matter, to be absolutely honest with you. Naught is naught, and it generates a tone, 260 hertz. When I increase this to plus 1, we're going to jump up 2 octaves, all the way up to 1046. We skip that octave in between, and you can see on the pop-up it says plus 3 octaves now. And again, another 2 octaves is so high. This is actually a guitar tuner, and it can't even hear stuff that high. So the outer ring is jumping up and down in multiples of 2 octaves. If I put it in low mode, it's now a low frequency oscillator. And I press the key on the keyboard, and you can see it in the virtual keyboard below. You can also see the oscilloscope doing something, but the oscilloscope doesn't have sufficient granularity, even down at its highest resolution, which is 20 Hertz. It simply can't catch what's going on here. The low frequency oscillator is generating a wave below our capacity to hear it. If I start playing further up the keyboard, eventually there, round about here, if you listen very, very carefully, and I'll turn it up, you can actually hear the pitches around about, I can just about hear that, but I can't in all honesty determine tone there. I can tell that there's some sort of rumble, but I can't tell there's a tone. So that's the limit of my hearing, 25 Hertz, and below that the tuner can't recognize it, and neither can I. So we're now down into low frequency oscillator territory. The oscillator cycling so slowly that we can't hear it. And you might think, well, what's the point of that? Well, they're not designed to be used as audio sources. They're designed, low frequency oscillators are designed to be used as modulation sources. To demonstrate this, I'm going to bring in oscillator 2. So we're actually going to have oscillator 2 generate some sound. I'm going to turn oscillator 1 off, and I'm going to generate a pulse wave with oscillator 2. That sounds like this. There we go. And you can see over here is our pulse wave. I'll have a bit more of a chat about pulse waves in a moment. Just while we're talking about low frequency oscillators, I want to demonstrate the low frequency oscillator in action. What I'm going to do is I'm going to modulate or change the pitch of oscillator 2. It's the only oscillator we can hear, but can you remember the last time we were looking at oscillator 1, it was generating, well, depending on what key I played, anywhere from 30 Hertz down to inaudible. So what I'm going to do is patch the sine wave from oscillator 1 into oscillator 2's frequency. So now oscillator 1 is modulating or changing oscillator 2's pitch, however many times a second the key I press on the keyboard. Practically indistinguishable. You can't actually tell the differences of those cycles. Watch what happens, however, when I play lower and lower keys on the keyboard. The speed, or the rate of modulation, is slowing down every time I press a key on the keyboard, because fundamentally oscillator 1 is still a pitch-based oscillator. Every key on the keyboard has its own control voltage, its own instruction on what pitch to generate, and oscillator 1 is saying, well, I've got my understanding of the world, I'm in low frequency oscillator mode, the key is telling me to play a key, a pitch this much higher than my native resolution, and it's resolving dum 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 at an oscillation that quick. It's still very difficult for us to tell what's actually going on there, because the pitch variance is so extreme. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to make that that pitch variance less extreme so that we can hear more clearly what's going on, because oscillator 1's level is basically its amplitude. It's the height of the wave. If you're talking in pure volume, when you turn the level of something up, it gets louder. But when it's being used as a modulation source, it instead is described as modulation depth. Its level is the same thing, it's just a different term to describe it. The best thing for me to do is just get on with it. I'm going to press a key, and I'm going to start bringing the level of the sine wave down. The speed of oscillation, in other words, how many times a second the sine wave is oscillating, is constant. That's not changing. What is changing is the absolute extent of how far up and down it's going. And now we've got something reasonably approaching vibrato. You see that I'm adjusting the speed of oscillator 1 using its fine-tune control now. So the inner knob is the fine control. The outer knob is the 2 octaves at a time, huge leaps, but the inner knob gives us very fine granularity, and I'm able to adjust the speed of this thing to get something approaching like a reasonable identifiable vibrato. There we go. Now the problem we've got is that oscillator 1 is still pitch based, so every single key that I press on the keyboard is going to generate a different speed of vibrato. It's getting faster and faster. But we can disengage that frequency response to the keyboard. Remember when we had a look in episode 1 at the advanced matrix? Let's hop back in again. These 3 pins in the advanced matrix are how we instruct the keyboard to output different control voltages to the oscillator frequency in order to basically track its pitch. If I disengage oscillator 1 by right-clicking, it's now generating an absolute oscillating frequency regardless of which key I press on the keyboard, and now I've got a fully functioning vibrato. So that's an example of a sine wave oscillator, oscillator 1 in this case, being used as a modulation source to change something somewhere else in the system. What we're changing is the pitch of oscillator 2. Every time we press a key, oscillator 2 is being oscillated up and down by a certain amount determined by the level, at a certain speed determined by the pitch or the speed of oscillator 1. Let's turn that vibrato into tremolo. We'll use the main matrix, although both matrices have modulation destinations for the output level. So instead of oscillator 1 modulating oscillator 2's frequency, now oscillator 1 is going to modulate the master output level. In other words, the entire the volume of the entire synthesizer is going to be increased and decreased using oscillator 1. Let's hear what that sounds like. It's very subtle at the moment. You can just about see in the oscilloscope the wave is just shimmering, but that means I just need to dial in a different level to get us something approaching a tremolo. Let's have a go. Slow it down. There you go. Working tremolo system. So both tremolo and vibrato are just modulations of different modulation destinations, either volume or output level in terms of tremolo or pitch in terms of vibrato. Having made quite a few changes to these oscillators, I'm going to use this as an example of how I basically reset my patch. This is why I created this default preset. I can simply select it and it's going to reset my synth back to my completely flat starting point. And we briefly introduced oscillator 2 when we had a look at its pulse wave. Let's see that in a little bit more detail. Right click on oscillator 1, left click on oscillator 2, patch the pulse wave into envelope. Every now and again I catch myself from saying square wave because at the moment it's not quite a square wave. Have a look at this wave. It's wider at the top than it is at the bottom. That basically means that this wave is properly described as a pulse wave. A pulse wave can also be described as a square wave if it's symmetrical. If the high control voltage is the same width as the low control voltage. Another way of describing that is a 50% duty cycle. Have a guess what the shape knob does for pulse waves. Changes the pulse width. This sound that you're hearing now is familiar to most analog synthesizer players because it's called pulse width modulation, or PWM. Really, really common setting that you'll find on many synthesizers. You get a dedicated knob to do exactly this job. Well, in the Xils case, it doesn't have a dedicated knob. It's the shape knob in the context of a pulse wave. Varies the pulse width. Let's have a look at the fourth and final waveform type. It's a triangle. Disengage pulse, engage triangle, So it's nearly a triangle, but it's leaning to one side. That's because the shape knob's not at 50%, but the shape knob at 50%. And we've got a triangle wave. If you have a look at the spectrum analyzer, the features of a triangle wave are that you get odd harmonics only. So here's our native note. At the moment I happen to be playing 130 Hz C. So this harmonic, the next harmonic along, is going to be at 390, because we basically skip even harmonics. 130, 260 gets left out. It should be here. 390 is the next harmonic that we see. Miss one, have one, miss one, have one. When you adjust the shape knob for a triangle wave, it reintroduces the even harmonics. In other words, it's going to tend it towards a sawtooth. The difference between a sawtooth wave and a triangle wave, despite the fact that they have different ratios of the tailing off of the harmonics, let's not worry about that. It's fundamentally the difference of whether or not it has even harmonics. But when you change the shape knob for a triangle wave, it reintroduces even harmonics, tending the shape more towards a sawtooth. And watch what happens in the oscilloscope to prove that. Now this is as far as it gets, but if that triangle kept on leaning over, it would turn into a sawtooth. There's some pretty straightforward physics behind the generation of all of these waveforms, which is why pretty much every synthesizer in the past 50 years has had sawtooths and triangles and sines and squares. These are the basic building blocks of sound, and you can see basically the triangle being deformed to turn it into a sawtooth there. Oscillator 2 has a setting that Oscillator 1 doesn't have. It's called Synchro down at the bottom here. It's currently turned off. If I turn this on, what it's basically done is slaved Oscillator 2 to Oscillator 1. So Oscillator 2 is now called the slave, Oscillator 1 is the master. And what this means is that Oscillator 2 doesn't get to determine its own pitch destiny anymore. It takes its pitch information from Oscillator 1. It's a very unusual situation. I've actually reset, just off camera, I've just reset the synthesizer, everything to 12 o'clock. All of my pitches are absolutely flat. I'm going to play a note on the synthesizer, and as you can see, we've just got the triangle of Oscillator 2. And here it is. Have a look at this pitch, 523 Hz. I'm now going to start adjusting the fine-tune control of Oscillator 2. So this should adjust the pitch. But it doesn't. It changes the tone. Have a look how. Just frozen the oscilloscope so that we can take a close look at this. What's basically happening is that the triangle wave is being drawn, but it's being interrupted. At this point here, Oscillator 1 is coming along and saying to Oscillator 2, start drawing your waveform again. I don't care that you want to carry on up here and finish the rest of the wave. Start again. It comes down and then basically interrupts it. So Oscillator 1, however fast it happens to be oscillating, is overriding Oscillator 2's desire to determine its own pitch. The weird effect of this is that pitch is now controlled from Oscillator 1 itself. And instead, we get this tonal variance. And you get some very unusual wave shapes. This here, you're not going to generate via any other means than hard sync. It's called hard sync, this process of synchronizing one oscillator to another. And you get these really abrupt changes of angle where the triangle's in the middle of doing something and then it leaps back down to its lowest extent and starts drawing the wave again. So you can see that Oscillator 2 is currently only managing to complete like 3/4, 2/3 of its waveform before Oscillator 1 comes along. If I speed Oscillator 2 up so that it's faster than Oscillator 1, oops, unfreeze my oscilloscope. Now what's happening is that Oscillator 2 is generating more than a single wave. We're starting from here, we're going up, we're coming down, we're getting to there, that's our single complete cycle, and then we're drawing so much of the next wave before the interruption comes along. So it's like 1 1/3 waves. And these different complex shapes that are generated by hard sync give you that kind of aggressive, nasal sound that somebody in the late 60s discovered was awesome, and every analog synthesizer in the 1970s had hard sync options. As you can see, oscillator 3 can be synced to either oscillators 1 or 2, but it's the same principles applying. There's not much more to say about oscillator 3 other than the fact that it's primarily dedicated to being a low frequency oscillator. It has a different range of controls than the other oscillators and fundamentally generates lower tones. So I just pressed the note that's 32 Hz for oscillator 3 would be 526 Hz for oscillator 2, with them both calibrated to 0. Don't forget, this 0 is effectively arbitrary, depending on what the calibration is set to. In the case of oscillator 3, it's -3 octaves below standard, below the default pitch of the synthesizer. And the final thing to mention is this lock button underneath. When you turn that on, the outer ring is locked and you can't accidentally change it. That's all that does. And that's the oscillators covered. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.